In the summer of 1917, deep within the Cypress Swamps of Louisiana, an expedition vanished without a trace. Locals whispered of strange echoes that drifted through the mist, carrying voices that weren't their own. Boats were found overturned, journals left open to pages filled with frantic scrawls, and something unseen watched from the shadows. No bodies were ever recovered, yet travelers reported footsteps in the mud and whispers that repeated their darkest fears. What befell the Belle Reve expedition? Was it a misstep into the unforgiving swamp? Or did something far older, far darker claim them? The swamp remembers, and it whispers. The Belle Reve expedition did not emerge from chance or whimsy. It was born of obsession and ambition, the kind that takes hold of a person and refuses to let go. In the early months of 1917, whispers circulated among the scholars and naturalists of New Orleans about an untouched stretch of swampland deep in Louisiana, cypress forests so dense and waterways so hidden that even seasoned guides spoke of losing their bearings after only a few miles. Stories of the land were as old as the bayou itself, tales of settlers who vanished overnight, of fishermen returning with strange scratches on their arms, and of echoes that carried voices not their own. It was precisely these accounts that drew the expedition's organizer, Jonathan Whitlock, a man with a penchant for both botany and the arcane, to assemble his team. Whitlock was meticulous, almost fanatical. His journals, preserved in fragments, reveal a mind consumed by detail. He drew maps of previous explorers' routes, cross-referencing them with folklore, Native American legends, and oral histories from Cajun families who had lived near the swamp for generations. The region he targeted was known locally as the Cypress Vale, a labyrinth of waterways, moss-draped trees, and fetid marshes, with a reputation for swallowing the unwary. Yet Whitlock described it in his letters as a paradise untouched by modern intrusion, a place where the old and the hidden might still speak. He believed that within its borders lay rare plants, unknown animal species, and perhaps traces of lost settlements, remnants of a past that time had almost erased. To this end, he recruited 5 men and 2 women, each with a distinct expertise. There was Robert Carver, a cartographer whose maps had been praised in academic circles; Eliza Montague, a botanist with a knack for cataloging flora in the most unforgiving environments; Samuel Briggs, a linguist fascinated by local dialects and folklore; Henry Duval, a guide reputed for navigating the treacherous swamps; Mary Linton, an ethnographer keen to document the oral traditions and stories of displaced communities; and Thomas Avery, a young journalist eager to chronicle the journey. Whitlock's charisma and insistence on precision convinced them all that this was not merely an exploration, but a venture into discovery itself, a chance to witness the untouched and the extraordinary. Preparation for the expedition was exhaustive. Supplies were cataloged with military precision, boats reinforced with iron rivets, provisions packed for weeks, journals and sketchbooks ready for observations. Whitlock insisted on nightly meetings to study every potential hazard: sudden fogs, treacherous currents, and the swamp's infamous ability to confuse direction. He lectured at length on caution, warning that the swamp had a memory, that those who entered without respect often disappeared, leaving only rumors behind. Yet even as he spoke, there was an undercurrent of excitement in his voice, a sense that danger was not a deterrent, but a necessary component of the undertaking. The team's motivations were as layered as the swamp itself. Some, like Eliza Montague, were purely scientific, seeking to document flora that had never been described. Others, like Thomas Avery, hungered for notoriety, for the story that would make headlines in newspapers long after the journey concluded. Whitlock, however, was driven by something more intangible, a desire to uncover secrets buried beneath the muck and the murky waters, to touch history in a way no one else had dared. His letters suggest he believed the swamp could reveal not just plants or artifacts, but the very patterns of human behavior in isolation, how fear, superstition, and ambition collided when men and women faced the unknown. Before they departed, Whitlock attempted to learn all he could from locals, but he was met with thinly veiled warnings, cryptic advice, and stories laced with fear. Cajun families spoke of the vale that hears and waters that remember. Fishermen spoke of whispers that carried across the bayou, and of trees that seemed to shift at night. Whitlock noted these with curiosity rather than alarm, convinced that such legends were either exaggeration or useful clues for understanding the swamp's ecology. The expedition's departure was marked by a sense of ceremony, the loading of boats at Belle Reve dock, the last letters exchanged with families, and the soft fading of the sun behind the dense canopy, casting shadows over the water like fingers reaching for the explorers. As they slipped into the cypress channels, the swamp closed behind them like a living barrier. Whitlock's meticulous maps guided their progress at first, but the deeper they went, the more the terrain seemed to resist clarity. Trees grew closer together, fog thickened into a nearly tangible wall, and currents twisted unnaturally, as though the swamp itself were reshaping to contain them. The origins and purpose of the Belle Reve expedition, so carefully plotted in journals and letters, were soon tested against an environment that would not be tamed. And what began as a scholarly pursuit gradually took on a darker, more unpredictable rhythm, as if the swamp had its own designs for those who dared enter. Before the Belle Reve expedition set foot in the Cypress Swamp, the air in the town of Natchitoches was thick with unease. Though the expedition members were eager and resolute, the locals could not hide their apprehension, nor did they try. They spoke in hushed tones about the swamp as though merely naming it might summon its attention. Children were warned not to stray too far into the tangled waterways, and fishermen who had ventured into the deeper cypress channels returned pale and silent, their eyes reflecting the kind of fear that had no words. Whitlock, ever the rationalist, dismissed most of these stories as superstition, cataloging them in his journal with clinical detachment. Yet even he could not ignore the consistency with which the same warnings surfaced. The first of these premonitions came from Old Man Thibodeau, a wiry Cajun whose family had lived along the bayou for generations. He approached Whitlock at the dock, a weathered finger tracing the outline of a map the explorer had been studying. His eyes were dark and intent. "You go into the vale," he rasped, "and it listens. It knows why you come. Some come for curiosity, some for greed, some for pride. All it remembers. All it takes." Whitlock nodded politely, scribbling the warning into his journal. But there was a shadow in the old man's gaze that lingered in his thoughts long after the conversation ended. Other locals offered subtler, almost lyrical warnings. A young mother weaving baskets by the riverbank hummed songs she claimed kept evil spirits away, whispering of echoes that repeat the words of those who enter. "Listen to the swamp at night," she warned, "and it might answer. It might call to you in your own voice, or worse, in the voice of someone you love." Whitlock jotted this as folklore, yet when he reread it later, the phrasing unsettled him. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that seemed almost like a chant, as though the swamp itself had already spoken through the people who knew it best. Some premonitions were less cryptic and far more visceral. Fishermen who had braved the upper channels spoke of strange shifts in the water, of currents that moved against logic, and of fogs that appeared without cause, clinging to faces and whispering names. One old trapper claimed to have seen figures walking on the water, shadows that matched no human form, and heard laughter that wasn't laughter, something that felt too deep and too hungry to be human. Whitlock recorded these accounts in meticulous detail, intending to study them as environmental anomalies, but even he could not entirely ignore the sense of dread that clung to every retelling. The expedition members themselves began to sense unease before they even entered the swamp. While preparing their boats and supplies at the dock, Eliza Montague confided in Whitlock that she had experienced a series of dreams she could not shake. Dreams of murky waters, skeletal trees, and indistinct figures moving just beyond her vision. In each dream, a voice called her name, but when she looked, no one stood there. Samuel Briggs, meanwhile, had found himself muttering lines of local dialect that he could not consciously recall learning, phrases warning of danger and urging retreat. These shared premonitions, though subtle, began to thread through the group, leaving a tension that words could not dispel. Whitlock attempted to anchor the team in reason. He organized rehearsals for navigation, trained them in emergency procedures, and reminded them of the scientific purpose behind the journey. Yet the locals' warnings seeped into the margins of their preparation. Nightly conversations in the lodgings were punctuated with uneasy glances at the fog rolling in from the bayou, as though the mist itself might carry the voices Old Man Thibodeau had spoken of. Guides cautioned that the swamp's geography could disorient travelers, and while this was rational, there was an edge to their words. a suggestion that the danger was not entirely physical, that perhaps the swamp possessed memory and intent. One particularly vivid warning came from a widower who lived on the edge of the waterway. He recounted a night when he had heard cries for help emanating from the swamp, only to discover that the sounds had echoed the voices of his own children, who were safe in their beds. He insisted that the swamp could mimic the living, and Whitlock, ever the scholar, could not deny the precision with which the story matched reports from other locals. The swamp, it seemed, was not just a landscape of trees and water, but a living archive of memory, capable of reflecting the deepest fears and desires of those who dared enter. By the time the Belle Reve expedition prepared to push into the swamp, a palpable tension had taken root. It was no longer a matter of maps and specimens. It was a matter of anticipation and unease. Every local tale, every dream, and every whispered warning coalesced into a dark tapestry that clung to the expedition like a shadow. The swamp awaited them, and the people who knew it best had made it clear. It was not a place to be trifled with, and those who entered unprepared might never return to tell the tale. After the disappearance of the Belle Reve expedition, the Cypress Swamp did not fall silent. On the contrary, those who dared approach the twisted waterways reported sounds so strange and unnerving that few could describe them with clarity, and even fewer dared to stay long enough to investigate. Fishermen, hunters, and wandering travelers spoke in trembling voices of echoes that did not belong to them, whispers that carried across the water even on windless nights, and the soft, deliberate cracking of branches where no one stood. The swamp seemed to hum with a rhythm entirely its own, as if attuned to some hidden pulse that resonated with the fears of those who ventured near. Some described hearing footsteps in the shallow mud, slow and deliberate, echoing across channels where no human had passed. At first these sounds were subtle, a soft squelch here, a faint rustle there, but soon grew unnervingly persistent, following intruders as they navigated the maze of cypress knees and hanging moss. One hunter claimed he had paused to rest only to hear footsteps circling his boat, then pause, then circle again, never approaching, never retreating, always present. When he finally dared to call out, the swamp answered not with a reply, but with a whisper of his own name, drawn out and elongated in a tone that felt neither malevolent nor benign, but intensely knowing. Birdsong, too, became strange. Witnesses reported that herons, normally silent at dusk, would mimic the cries of children, sometimes calling names they had never heard before. Frogs and insects joined the eerie chorus in uncanny unison, creating an unsettling cadence that seemed far too deliberate to be natural. One fisherman swore that a night spent in his boat under the cypress canopy was punctuated by a recurring refrain, the sound of journal pages flipping, as if someone or something was reading the words left behind by the missing expedition. The wind carried these sounds in impossible directions, sometimes seeming to come from beneath the water itself, from the very mud of the swamp. Local storytellers, wary of outsiders, spoke of the swamp's memory as though it were alive, capable of repeating moments from the past. According to them, the Belle Reve expedition's last cries, or the panic etched into their journals, had been absorbed into the swamp's fabric, replaying themselves for anyone attuned enough to listen. One trapper described hearing a woman scream his own mother's name, only to recognize it as the voice recorded in his dreams the night before. A guide who had attempted to map the waterways afterward reported hearing laughter echoing from impossibly far distances, laughter that matched nothing in his own experience yet felt deeply personal, as if the swamp knew him. Even more disturbing were the reports of what witnesses called the chorus of absence. Travelers would hear the sound of multiple people moving, speaking and sometimes arguing, yet when they scanned the murky waters and knotted tree trunks, they found nothing. Boats seemed to rock with unseen hands, ropes would tighten without wind, and the water's surface would ripple as if disturbed by countless footsteps just beneath. Some who returned to the swamp repeatedly reported that the sounds grew more elaborate over time, layering voices, footsteps, and rustling into patterns that seemed to mock those who had dared enter. Whispers often took on a sinister mimicry. A young botanist who attempted to collect samples for research later recounted that she heard someone calling for help, repeating her own words exactly as she had spoken them, yet coming from a place no human could have reached. The voice changed pitch, sometimes pleading, sometimes taunting, and always echoing in a way that made it impossible to discern origin. The phenomenon was consistent enough across multiple accounts that researchers began to wonder whether it was psychological, hallucinations born of fear, or something far more inexplicable, as though the swamp itself had learned to manipulate perception, replaying the final moments of the lost expedition in eerie, auditory loops. Even night sounds, normally mundane, became sinister under the veil of the swamp. Crickets, frogs, and distant owls combined to create a layering of tone and rhythm that unnerved even seasoned guides. The combination of fog, reflection on the water, and the persistent echoing of the lost expedition's presence gave rise to a pervasive feeling that the swamp itself was listening, anticipating, and perhaps even guiding intruders along predetermined paths. Those who lingered too long described a creeping familiarity, as though the sounds were not just around them but inside them, rewriting their perception of the swamp's boundaries and their own place within it. The unsettling sounds were not confined to a single area. They appeared unpredictably, sometimes dozens of yards apart, sometimes directly beneath the feet of those attempting to track them. Accounts of echoing cries, footsteps, and whispers were passed down in local lore, often dismissed by outsiders as exaggeration or superstition. Yet the consistency, detail, and intensity of these reports suggest that something in the swamp had changed, or had always been there, quietly waiting to remind those who approached that the Belle Reve expedition had not truly left. The first tangible signs of the Belle Reve expedition came days after the team was reported missing. Search parties, initially cautious and hesitant, began to penetrate the labyrinthine channels of the Cypress Swamp, their boats cutting slowly through the dark, still water. The swamp, thick with mist and hanging moss, seemed to resist every attempt to map its passageways, forcing rescuers to rely on intuition and the faintest traces left behind by the missing explorers. It was then that the first overturned boat appeared, half submerged, its oars splintered and scattered. There were no bodies nearby, no signs of struggle, only the silent, waterlogged vessel bobbing like a ghost upon the murky currents. Within hours, other boats were discovered, each in a similarly unnerving state. Some were lodged against thick cypress roots as though abandoned in haste. Others had capsized entirely, contents spilling into the swamp. Canoes, personal belongings, and fragments of tools floated aimlessly, and rescuers noted that the arrangement of these objects seemed almost deliberate, forming a pattern that no one could decipher. Journal entries, when recovered, were soaked and smeared with mud, yet a few pages remained legible. The entries reflected escalating anxiety among the expedition members, each more frantic than the last. Whitlock's handwriting, typically neat and precise, grew jagged and hurried. One page contained only a single repeated phrase: "It watches. It follows. We are not alone." Mary Linton's notebook, partially preserved on a tree branch above the water, contained sketches of figures in the mist, drawn with trembling hands. She documented strange symbols carved into tree trunks, lines and spirals that defied immediate interpretation, etched with what appeared to be deliberate care. Some markings resembled letters, but none matched any known language or script. Others formed geometric patterns, loops, and angles that seemed to follow a hidden logic. Guides who examined them hesitated to touch the bark, claiming a subtle, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the carvings, a sensation that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. Among the recovered items, certain artifacts suggested a ritualistic undertone, a hint that the expedition might have encountered forces beyond the natural. A small ceremonial dagger, its handle encrusted with moss and dark residue, was found lodged in the trunk of a tree. Alongside it lay broken pieces of what appeared to be candles, half melted, and a small water-damaged charm inscribed with symbols that mirrored some of those on the trees. Whether these items had been left by the expedition itself or by an unseen presence within the swamp, no one could determine. Local lore hinted at previous settlers and indigenous groups performing rites to appease spirits said to inhabit the Cypress waters. But the precision and context of these objects suggested something immediate, recent, and unnervingly personal. The journals revealed more than just anxiety. They chronicled an increasing sense of disorientation. Members of the expedition wrote of navigating the same waterways repeatedly, despite following Whitlock's meticulously drawn maps. Landmarks appeared where none should exist, and familiar trees seemed to shift position when no one was looking. One page, partially torn, contained the words, "We walked in circles. The swamp rearranges itself. We cannot trust our eyes. The notion that the swamp itself was sentient, an idea Whitlock had once dismissed, was gaining credibility in the eyes of those piecing together the evidence. Some journals recorded sounds, echoing the reports of those who later approached the swamp. Cries for help, laughter, footsteps, and whispers, sometimes resembling the voices of expedition members, were documented in painstaking detail, alongside the growing dread that they were being followed, studied, or even hunted. Carver's cartography notes reflected these disturbances. Topographical features were altered, inexplicably, between one page and the next, suggesting a swamp that resisted human mapping, a place where memory and geography intertwined in ways no outsider could predict. Rescue parties also found peculiar arrangements in the environment surrounding the abandoned boats. Rocks, branches, and mud were moved in deliberate patterns, as though someone or something had attempted to communicate, to leave a message that eluded understanding. Some suggested the patterns resembled ritualistic symbols. Others argued they were natural formations manipulated by wind and water. Yet the precision and consistency of these arrangements across multiple locations made such explanations unlikely. Every subsequent search reinforced the idea that the swamp itself had a voice, one that could be heard through the objects it allowed to surface and the traces it permitted to remain. Even when investigators recovered personal items, knapsacks, sketchbooks, boots, they often found them arranged as though for display, sometimes on tree stumps, sometimes floating upright in the water. No signs of struggle were present, yet the care and placement suggested intention, a deliberate communication. This left those who studied the site questioning whether the expedition had succumbed to external forces, succumbed to the labyrinthine geography, or perhaps had been drawn into something far older and more enigmatic, a presence woven into the swamp itself, leaving messages only in forms it could control. As days passed after the initial discoveries in the Cypress Vale, the full weight of the Belle Reve expedition's disappearance became undeniable. Rescuers moved cautiously, boats cutting through the thick black waters while the dense canopy of cypress trees obscured the sky, casting shadows that twisted with the fog. Every bend in the waterway brought new unsettling discoveries, overturned vessels, scattered personal effects, and journals that only deepened the mystery. Yet no human presence could be found. Not a single member of the expedition emerged from the swamp alive or dead, leaving the search teams to confront a profound and creeping dread, a sense that the swamp itself had claimed them before anyone could intervene. Local guides, initially confident in their knowledge of the waterways, quickly grew uneasy. Henry Duval, who had served as the expedition's lead guide, led multiple search parties, retracing the channels he had once navigated with confidence. Yet even he began to falter, admitting in private that the swamp seemed to resist them, as though shifting its contours, rearranging routes, and redirecting currents. "It's alive," he muttered one evening, his voice barely audible over the hum of insects and frogs. "It knows we're looking for them. It doesn't want to be disturbed." Rescue teams followed footprints that led into the water only to vanish, as if swallowed by the swamp's mud. Canoes drifted in impossible directions, and the fog appeared to roll back into areas already scouted, erasing any trace of progress. Witnesses reported disturbing phenomena along the search routes. One trapper recounted hearing shouting, voices calling for help, some familiar, others unknown, emanating from deep within the swamp. He recalled how the sounds seemed to surround him, echoing unnaturally, repeating phrases in distorted tones. "Help us. Come back. Leave. Never leave." Attempts to follow these cries invariably led to dead ends, with searchers emerging hours later at locations entirely different from where the sounds had originated. For those who had followed the expedition closely, the notion that the swamp itself was interfering with their efforts grew impossible to ignore. Reports from the families of the missing also began to surface, adding an unsettling layer to the narrative. Letters sent by the expedition prior to their disappearance were recovered, some postmarked days after their expected arrival in towns near the swamp. The letters contained descriptions of minor successes, documented plant species, notes on water depth, sketches of unusual wildlife, but also included increasingly frantic warnings, mentions of inexplicable sounds, shifting landmarks, and the sensation of being observed. Some pages ended mid-sentence with words crossed out, smudged, or scratched over, suggesting hurried writing in panic or confusion. Families who read these letters felt horror, as if the words themselves carried the fear of those trapped within the swamp. Efforts to deploy additional search parties brought fresh reports of strange phenomena. One group described discovering personal belongings, boots, satchels, journals, arranged in unnatural positions on tree stumps or partially submerged in channels, seemingly organized with intent. The swamp appeared to resist retrieval. Items floated back into deeper waters or shifted when teams approached. Even local law enforcement, accustomed to dealing with disappearances and drownings, expressed unease. Officers noted the consistency of these occurrences across multiple search attempts, eventually concluding that the swamp's treacherous terrain was only part of the explanation. Something else, something unknown, was manipulating the environment. The personal accounts of those who attempted rescue were equally unnerving. Samuel Briggs, returning from a late-day sweep, claimed to have heard Whitlock's voice calling from behind a stand of trees, only to find the path clear and no sign of anyone present. Rescue teams observed strange patterns in the mist, fleeting shadows moving just beyond the line of sight, and a recurring sensation that unseen eyes were tracking every step. Panic began to creep into the efforts, and some searchers refused to continue once night fell, leaving portions of the swamp unexamined for fear of becoming lost themselves. Over time, search strategies became increasingly desperate. Teams mapped every channel and surveyed every tree-lined corridor, yet the results remained the same. Boats abandoned and overturned, personal items strewn or deliberately arranged, journals with fragmented, terrified accounts but no expedition members. Some theorized that the swamp's dense terrain, hidden quicksand, and dangerous wildlife had claimed the explorers. Yet even these explanations failed to account for the repeated reports of inexplicable movements, echoes, and voices. It was as though the swamp had absorbed the missing members entirely, leaving only shadows and artifacts as proof of their existence. As word of the failed search spread, the case became a source of local legend. The swamp was avoided by anyone who valued their safety, and curiosity gave way to fear. For the families in the wider community, the absence of bodies and definitive answers left a gaping void. Every day that passed without discovery reinforced the notion that the Belle Reve expedition had not merely gone missing, but had been claimed, altered or absorbed by a force beyond human understanding, one that left only fragments, echoes, and unanswered questions in its wake. As the Belle Reve expedition faded into legend, speculation about their fate grew increasingly complex, ranging from the rational to the chillingly supernatural. Early investigators sought to explain the disappearances through natural causes, drawing on the treacherous geography of the Louisiana cypress swamps. The terrain itself was a labyrinth of channels, sinkholes, and hidden sink traps known locally as bayou quicksands, where a single misstep could swallow a person whole. Even seasoned guides warned that the swamp was deceptive. Landmarks shifted, water levels rose and fell unpredictably, and dense fog could erase all sense of direction. From this perspective, it was easy to imagine members of the expedition succumbing to exhaustion, hypothermia, or disorientation, wandering in circles until the swamp claimed them. Yet these natural explanations failed to account for the more disturbing evidence. Overturned boats, journals with frantic warnings, and personal belongings deliberately arranged suggested a level of intentionality, or at least something more than random accident. Researchers noted that footprints often ended abruptly in deep mud, only to appear again yards away, as if the terrain itself had altered their path. Whispers and repeated cries reported by locals and search parties suggested a presence beyond mere environmental hazards. Each new discovery blurred the line between accident and enigma, pushing investigators toward darker, more speculative theories. One popular hypothesis centered on predation and wildlife. The swamps were home to alligators, venomous snakes, and swarms of biting insects, any of which could easily harm or kill an unprepared traveler. Some accounts hinted that scavengers, drawn by the scent of humans, could drag remains into unseen depths. However, this theory struggled under scrutiny. No remains of the expedition members were ever recovered, and animals would not arrange journals, personal items, or artifacts in patterns that seemed deliberate. Additionally, repeated reports of sounds and voices inconsistent with any natural phenomenon continued to emerge, suggesting that the danger was not entirely corporeal. Local folklore offered a more unsettling alternative. Stories passed down through generations spoke of spirits and guardians inhabiting the Cypress Vale, entities bound to the swamp itself. These spirits were said to remember every wrong, every trespass, and every intrusion, punishing intruders in ways subtle and terrifying. Some recounted travelers glimpsing figures in the mist that mirrored their own shapes, moving independently yet eerily in sync with them. Whispers that repeated personal fears, cries for help, and distorted laughter were attributed to these entities, manifestations of the swamp's consciousness or memory. In this framework, the disappearance of the Belle Reve expedition was less an accident and more an encounter with an ancient and watchful force that responded to human curiosity with lethal precision. Other theories suggested that the expedition had stumbled upon remnants of an older, more arcane history. Some researchers pointed to the cryptic markings on cypress trunks and strange artifacts found among the overturned boats as evidence of a ritualistic or occult influence. Perhaps the swamp concealed traces of old settlements, secret societies, or religious rites whose echoes persisted across decades. If true, the expedition may have intruded into a sphere of influence that resisted human comprehension, their movements interpreted as violation, their presence triggering an invisible mechanism of retribution. Observers noted that the markings often resembled symbols designed to guide, warn, or trap, suggesting that someone, or something, was shaping the swamp to serve its own inscrutable purpose. Psychological explanations also emerged. Some theorists argued that fear itself became a predator in the swamp, a contagion amplified by isolation, fatigue, and disorientation. The expedition's journals documented escalating paranoia, misperception, and hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing figures in the fog, and sensing invisible observers. It was plausible that these mental disturbances compounded with the swamp's natural dangers, creating a feedback loop of panic and disorientation that ultimately led to the explorers' disappearance. Yet even this rational explanation struggled to account for the repeated patterns observed by search parties afterward, particularly the arrangement of belongings and cryptic markings that suggested deliberate action. Finally, a small but persistent group of theorists embraced a wholly supernatural interpretation. They posited that the Cypress Vale functioned as a threshold, a place where the boundary between the living and the spectral blurred. From this perspective, the expedition's disappearance was not accidental, but an encounter with forces older than the land itself. Entities capable of mimicking voices, rearranging matter, and ensnaring human consciousness. Proponents cited the swamp's persistent echoes, its inexplicable patterns, and the haunting presence reported by those who approached years later as evidence of an intelligence that defied natural explanation. Across all theories, one element remained consistent. The swamp had claimed the expedition in a way that defied simple understanding. Whether through natural hazard, predatory forces, psychological collapse, ritualistic interference, or supernatural agency, the result was the same. The men and women of Belle Reve vanished, leaving behind only traces of their journey, the eerie echoes of their last days, and a growing legend that would persist in whispers and warnings for generations. In the years that followed the disappearance of the Belle Reve expedition, the echoing Cypress Swamp became more than just a place on a map. It became a living legend, a name spoken with equal parts fear and fascination across Louisiana. By the 1920s, locals no longer referred to it simply as the swamp, but as the Vale, a boundary between the world of the living and something much older, much darker. The story of Belle Reve was retold in whispers around firelight, the details shifting like the mist itself. Some claimed the expedition had disturbed sacred ground. Others said the swamp had chosen them, calling them into its depths to join its eternal chorus. Those who ventured near the swamp in later decades often reported inexplicable phenomena. Hunters spoke of hearing faint cries drifting over the water at dusk, voices that seemed to call their names, sometimes in the tone of a loved one long dead. Fishermen reported seeing lantern lights moving through the fog when no one was there, or catching glimpses of figures gliding between the cypress roots just beyond the reach of their lamps. Even skeptics who entered determined to debunk the myth found themselves unsettled by the eerie sense that the air itself carried memory, as if the swamp were breathing through time. In 1934, a small team from the Louisiana Folklore Society recorded the testimonies of locals living along the Atchafalaya Basin. They found a remarkable consistency in the stories. Every account described the swamp as echoing in some way, voices repeating, sounds circling back, even footsteps that seemed to follow the traveler from behind. One farmer described it as a place that remembers everything you say and gives it back wrong. Another spoke of seeing the outlines of the lost Belle Reve camp in the mist one morning, complete with shadows moving inside the tents, before it dissolved as the sun rose. Decades later, modern investigators and historians tried to approach the mystery through science. Acoustic researchers speculated that the swamp's unique geography might amplify and distort sound, causing echoes to seem human. Geologists pointed to natural gas vents that could produce low hums and strange lights at night. Yet even these rational explanations failed to erase the unease. Field recordings captured within the swamp contained faint murmurs that, when enhanced, resembled human speech. No one could agree on what the voices said. Some heard pleas for help, others prayers, others laughter. Local historians uncovered new fragments of the Belle Reve expedition's documents, pages that seemed to describe the swamp as alive and mimicking us. One torn entry read, "The water speaks when no wind moves. We must not answer it." That line became a warning passed through generations. Never answer the swamp when it calls. Even now, residents near the old boundary avoid entering after sunset. The trees are said to shift when unobserved, the fog to thicken around those who linger too long. In the 1970s, when environmentalists attempted to map and preserve the area, several teams reported equipment failure and disorientation deep inside the swamp. Compass needles spun aimlessly, batteries drained in minutes, and distant voices echoed through their radios. The recordings captured during that period, strange, rhythmic tapping and low whispers, were stored in archives but never released to the public. To this day, only fragments circulate online, fueling speculation that the swamp hides something more than nature can explain. What began as a 1917 disappearance had, over time, transformed into a cultural mirror. The echoing Cypress Swamp came to represent the enduring tension between human curiosity and the unknowable. Its legend persisted because it touched something primal, the fear that some places remember what we forget, and that when we disturb them, they do not forgive easily. Even as modern technology sought to measure and map it, the swamp remained defiant, whispering the same refrain across generations, a reminder that some echoes are not meant to fade. If the echoes of the Belle Reve expedition still linger in your thoughts, you're not alone. Every story we uncover here reminds us that history is never silent. It only waits for someone brave enough to listen. The swamp may have swallowed its secrets, but its whispers reach across time, warning us that some mysteries never truly rest. So tell me, what do you think happened in those murky waters of 1917 Louisiana? Were the voices nothing more than the tricks of nature? Or something older, something watching? Leave your thoughts below, because your theories might just lead us deeper into the next unsolved chapter. And if you crave more forgotten crimes, abandoned histories, and echoes from the dark corners of the past, subscribe before the mist fades. Every week we step further into places time has tried to bury, and sometimes they whisper back,